The river Vistula moves through the history of Poland like a dark, heavy vein of silver, carrying with it the timber of the deep forests and the grain of the golden plains. In the winter of 1473, in the merchant city of Toruń, the river was a frozen expanse of white, silent and unyielding, mirroring the vast cold sky above. It was here, in a tall brick house that smelled faintly of spices and the metallic tang of copper, that a boy was born into a world of commerce and calculation. They named him Nicolaus. To the world he would become known by the Latinized resonance of his name, Nicolaus Copernicus, the man who stopped the sun and moved the earth. But long before he rearranged the heavens, he was simply a child staring out of a frosted window, mesmerized by the slow turning wheel of the night. His beginnings were rooted in the earth, not the sky. His father was a prosperous merchant, a man who dealt in the red gold of copper, a trade that gave the family their name, Copernic, lightly drawn from the village of the copper mines. Young Mikołaj's world was one of ledgers, weights, and the clinking of coins, a life governed by the terrestrial laws of trade and exchange. But the universe, it seemed, had a different curriculum in mind for the boy, one that would begin with a profound and sudden silence. When Nicolaus was only 10 years old, the bustle of the merchant house ceased. His father died, leaving a void that the wealth of copper could not fill. This was the defining fracture of his life, the moment Mikołaj became an orphan of the Vistula. The security of the merchant class evaporated, replaced by the imposing shadow of his maternal uncle Lucas Watsonrode. Uncle Lucas was not a man of warm embraces or gentle bedtime stories. He was a titan of the church, a future Prince Bishop of Warmia, a man whose ambition was as rigid and soaring as the Gothic cathedrals he governed. Under the care of this formidable guardian, the orphan was steered away from the copper trade and toward the priesthood. Watsonrode saw in his nephew a sharp, pliable mind, a vessel to be filled with canon law and theology. He intended to forge a bishop. Instead, by sending the boy out into the wider world to learn, he inadvertently forged a revolutionary. Thus began the decades of the wandering student. Nicolaus became a traveller of the mind, drifting between the great universities of Europe like a planet seeking its orbit. First came Krakow, where the air was thick with the smoke of hearth fires and the dust of manuscripts. It was here, amidst the liberal arts, that he first touched the astrolabe and learned the geometry of the spheres. But the northern sky was often clouded, and the hunger for clarity drove him south, over the Alps, to the sun-drenched intellect of Italy. He went to Bologna to study law, but his heart had already been captured by a different jurisdiction, the laws of the stars. In Bologna he did not live in a dormitory of lawyers, but in the home of Domenico Maria de Novara, the university's chief astronomer. This was the turning point, the moment the orphan found a new father figure, not in a merchant or a bishop, but in a skeptic. Novara was a man who dared to look at the sky and see not just the glory of God, but the errors of man. Together the master and the student stood on rooftops in the cool Italian nights, shivering as they charted the positions of the wandering stars. It was 1497 when they observed the moon eclipse, the bright red eye of the star Aldebaran. In the silence of that observation, watching the celestial mechanics unfold, a seed of doubt was planted in Copernicus's mind. He began to see the universe of Ptolemy the Ancient, geocentric model that the church and the universities held as sacred truth, not as a perfect divine order, but as a clumsy, rattling machine. What disturbed Copernicus was not just the math, it was the aesthetics. He was a man obsessed with beauty and symmetry. The current model of the universe relied on a mathematical trick called the equant, a device that allowed planets to wobble and change speed to make the calculations fit the observation that the Earth was stationary. To Copernicus, this was a monstrosity. He believed that the Creator, the supreme artificer of the cosmos, would never design such a chaotic, lurching system. The universe had to be a perfect machine, a celestial ballet of uniform circular motion. The ugliness of the math offended his soul. He began to suspect that the complexity existed only because humanity insisted on standing at the center of the stage. Yet Nicolaus was not merely a dreamer with his head in the clouds. He was a true Renaissance man, a polymath who understood the gritty realities of life on Earth. While his mind dismantled the heavens, his hands were busy healing the sick and managing the coin of the realm. He studied medicine in Padua, learning the humours of the body, and took a doctorate in law from Ferrara, all without ever taking the final vows of a priest. He returned to Poland, not as a recluse, but as a canon of the cathedral chapter, a diplomat and a physician to the elite. His life became a study in duality. By day, he was a pragmatic administrator in the remote province of Warmia. He was the man who rode out to the countryside to treat bishops for gout and fevers, mixing herbal remedies and consulting the stars for favourable prognostics. He was the economist who looked at the rampant inflation destroying the Polish currency and formulated the principle that bad money drives out good, a foundational economic truth centuries ahead of its time. He was even a warrior. In 1521, when the Teutonic Knights swept through the land, burning villages and laying siege to the castle of Olsztyn, it was not a general who stood on the ramparts, but the astronomer. Copernicus organized the defense, securing provisions, reinforcing the walls, and commanding the garrison while the horizon glowed with the fires of war. He held the castle. The man who sought the peace of the spears was forced to navigate the chaos of the trenches. And yet there was always the secret. There was always the hidden room in his mind where the sun stood still. Throughout these years of public service, amidst the scandal of living with his housekeeper Anna Schilling, relationship that drew the ire of his superiors and forced him into a lonely bachelorhood, and amidst the noise of administration, he painted. He was a skilled artist, capturing his own likeness in a self-portrait that revealed a face of sharp intelligence and deep reserve. But his greatest art was invisible. He retreated to a tower in the town of Frombork, overlooking the Vistula lagoon. Here, the orphan of the Vistula found his true home, isolated from the academic centres of Europe, far from the printing presses and the debates of the learned men. He began to write. He wrote not for fame, for he feared the ridicule of the foolish, but for the sheer harmonious necessity of truth. He began to draft a little commentary, a brief handwritten manuscript circulated only among a few trusted friends. In it he whispered the heresy that would shatter the crystal spheres, that the earth was not the heavy, motionless centre of all things, but merely another wanderer, drifting through the dark, spinning around a burning throne. The work was slow. It was a cathedral built in silence, stone by stone, observation by observation, over 30 years. He watched the planets dance and saw that if he simply stopped the earth and let it spin, the monstrous equant disappeared. The chaos vanished. Suddenly, the universe was elegant. It was simple. It was worthy of a supreme artificer. But as the years turned into decades, and his hair turned from the colour of copper to the white of the winter frost, the manuscript remained locked away. He was a physician who knew the frailty of the human heart, and he knew that the world was not ready to be dislodged from the centre of creation. He was content to let the truth sleep in his study, a secret shared only with the silent stars, until a knock came at his door that would force the universe to open. The heavy oak door groaned on its iron hinges, the sound echoing through the stone corridors of the canon's house in Frombork. Standing on the threshold was not a bailiff or a bishop, but a young man, flushed with the cold air of the Baltic coast and the heat of intellectual fervour. This was George Joachim Rethetikus, a mathematician from distant Wittenberg, a Lutheran risking heresy to speak with a Catholic canon about the geometry of the heavens. He had come to find the man who stopped the sun, but the figure who greeted him was not merely an astronomer lost in the ether. The old man standing in the doorway, with eyes that held the depth of the winter sky, was a mosaic of 1,000 different lives, all lived under the long stretching shadow of duty. To understand why the manuscript lay hidden for so long, one had to look back through the mists of time, back to the banks of the Vistula River where the story began. He was born, Nicolaus Copernicus, in the bustling merchant city of Toruń, a place where the scent of gingerbread mingled with the metallic tang of the copper trade that gave his family their name. But the golden haze of childhood was shattered early. When Nicolaus was only 10, the anchor of his world, his father, was taken by the silence of the grave. It was then that the shadow first fell over him, the protective, towering shadow of his maternal uncle, Nicolaus Copernicus. Nicolaus was not a man of half measures. He was the Prince Bishop of Warmia, a figure of immense political and ecclesiastical power, carved from the same hard stone as the cathedrals he governed. He swept the orphan boy into his care, not with a warm embrace, but with a blueprint for a life of service. Under the bishop's guidance, Nicolaus became an academic wanderer, a perpetual student drifting through the great halls of learning in Italy. He drank from the fountains of knowledge in Krakow, Bologna, Padua, and Ferrara, collecting degrees like polished stones. He studied canon law. He dissected the human form to understand the fragility of the flesh, and he mastered the administration of dioceses. Yet, amidst the lectures and the Latin, it was in Bologna that the cracks in the ancient world began to show. There he lived not as a prince of the church, but as a housemate to the astronomer Domenico Maria di Novara. Together, on cool Italian nights, they stood on rooftops, watching the moon slide silently over the star Aldebaran. In the quiet camaraderie of observation, Nicolaus learned that the great Ptolemy, the architect of the geocentric universe, was not infallible. He saw that the math required to keep the Earth at the center was messy, a clunky contraption of imaginary circles and arbitrary speeds known as equants. To a mind that sought the divine elegance of a supreme artificer, the equant was a monstrous construction, a blemish on the face of creation. He began to dream of a system where the planets moved in perfect, uniform circles, a celestial ballet choreographed by simple, symmetrical laws. But dreams do not defend castles, and Nicolaus was called back to the harsh realities of the north. He returned to Warmia not as a revolutionary scientist, but as a practical man of affairs, living deep within the bishop's shadow. For years he served as his uncle's secretary and physician, mixing herbs and casting horoscopes to treat the ailments of the elite. He was a diplomat, navigating the treacherous waters between the King of Poland and the Teutonic Order. And when the fires of war finally erupted in 1521, it was the astronomer who donned the mantle of the commander. As the Teutonic Knights ravaged the countryside, burning villages to ash, Copernicus was placed in charge of the defense of Ulstein Castle. He did not retreat to his study. He organized the provisions, strengthened the walls, and personally directed the resistance, holding the fortress against the siege. He proved that the mind that contemplated the stars could also secure the earth. In the aftermath, he turned his intellect to the ruins of the economy, seeing how debased currency was destroying the livelihoods of the common people. He formulated a principle that would echo through history, that bad money drives out good. He argued that inflation was a scourge caused by an oversupply of coin, applying the same rigorous logic to the flow of gold as he did to the flow of planets. Yet even a man of such steely competence had a heart that yearned for connection. For a decade, the canon's house was warmed by the presence of Anna Schilling, a woman who served as his housekeeper but held a place in his life that whispered of something deeper. She was his companion in the long dark winters, a tether to the human world while his mind drifted through the spheres. But the church was a jealous master. The scandal of their cohabitation reached the ears of the new bishop, Dantiscus, a man far less forgiving than Uncle Lucas. With a heavy heart, complying with the strictures of his station, Copernicus was forced to banish Anna from his home, leaving him once again in the solitude of his tower. It was into this solitude that Rheticus arrived, the knock that shattered the silence. The young mathematician's devotion was the spark that finally ignited the dry tinder of Copernicus's resolve. Rheticus did not see a heretic. He saw a genius who had painted a portrait of the universe that was finally, achingly beautiful. He urged the old man to release his life's work, De Revolutionibus Orbium Celestium to the printers in Nuremberg. The decision was made. The manuscript, filled with diagrams of a sun-centered cosmos, was sent away. But as the pages were pressed and the ink dried, the astronomer's strength began to fade. The body that had withstood the rigors of war and the weight of years succumbed to a stroke, leaving him in a twilight state, drifting between the world of men and the world of stars. Legend tells us that on May 24, 1543, as Copernicus lay on his deathbed, the first printed copy of his book was placed into his trembling hands. His fingers, cool and papery, brushed against the leather binding. He had moved the earth, stopped the sun, and reorganized the heavens, all to satisfy a desire for harmony, to erase the ugly equant and reveal the perfect machine of God. He did not wait to hear the applause or the condemnation that would follow. He simply closed his eyes, his spirit finally free to ascend into the silent spinning vastness he had spent a lifetime mapping, leaving behind a world that would never be the same. The sun remained fixed, a burning throne in the center of the dark, while the bishop's shadow finally dissolved into the light of a new dawn. The story of the mind is often a story of solitary struggle, but the gears of history are turned by many hands. As the candle burned low in the chamber of the departed astronomer, the legacy of his thought began to drift outward, carried on the winds of change toward other minds, other dreamers who would look up and see not a ceiling, but a limitless ocean. One such dreamer was already waiting in the wings of time, a man who would take the elegant circles of Copernicus and shatter them into ellipses, forging a new physics from the raw data of the stars. To understand the architecture of the heavens, one must sometimes look away from the stars and down into the quiet, fog-laden streets where life begins. Before the legacy could take flight, before the ellipses of future astronomers could shatter the crystalline spheres, there was simply a boy standing on the banks of the Vistula River. The story of Nicolaus Copernicus does not begin in the void of space, but in the red brick Gothic embrace of Toruń, a city humming with a trade of copper and grain, where the river winds like a dark ribbon through the heart of Poland. Born Nicolaus Copernicus in the winter of 1473, he entered a world defined by the smell of metal and the rhythm of commerce. His father was a merchant of copper, a man of earthly weights and measures, whose trade gave the family their name linked to the village of Koperniki and its mines. But the solidity of this life was fragile. When Nicolaus was only 10 years old, the anchor of his world was lifted. His father died, leaving a silence in the house that no amount of copper coin could fill. Into this void stepped his maternal uncle, Lucas Watson Rhode, a man of immense power and severe ambition, who would soon rise to become the Prince Bishop of Warmia. Under the shadow of his uncle's woolen robes, the young Nicolaus was groomed not for the merchant's scale, but for the shepherd's crook. He was to be a man of the church, yet the mind of the young orphan was a restless thing, a wanderer seeking a home it could not yet name. For over a decade he drifted through the great universities of Europe, a perpetual student, drinking from the wells of liberal arts in Krakow, medicine in Padua, and law in Ferrara. He gathered doctorates like polished stones, yet he never took the final vows of a priest. He remained on the threshold, watching, learning, and waiting. It was in Italy, beneath the warmer, golden light of the south, that the true turning point arrived. The segment of his life known as the years in Bologna became the crucible of his thought. In 1496, he found lodging in the home of the university's chief astronomer, Domenico Maria de Navarra. Navarra was not merely a teacher, he was a kindred spirit, a man who harbored a secret dissatisfaction with the clumsy complexities of the ancient maps. They became an inseparable pair. The older master and the quiet lodger from the north, standing together on the rooftop terraces of Bologna, shivering in the night air as they charted the slow drift of the constellations. It was here, in the companionship of the dark, that Navarra taught Copernicus to look with a critical eye. They did not just record the stars, they questioned them. On a crisp night in March of 1497, they watched together as the moon crept slowly over the bright star Aldebaran, extinguishing its light. This occultation was a revelation. It whispered of distances and geometries that did not align with the rigid cages of Ptolemy's universe. But it was not merely observational data that troubled Copernicus. It was a matter of art. He possessed the soul of a painter, a man who would later craft his own self-portrait with delicate brushstrokes, capturing the intense, inward-looking gaze that defines him to this day. To such a mind, the Ptolemaic system was an aesthetic nightmare. The ancients had relied on a mathematical trick called the equant, a point in space around which a planet moved at a uniform speed, but which was not the center of its circle. To Copernicus, this was a monstrous construction, a violation of the divine symmetry that the supreme artificer would surely have employed. He believed the universe was a perfect machine, a celestial ballet of absolute harmony. He did not move the sun to the center because he had better telescopes. He had none, but because placing the burning throne of the sun in the center made the dance more beautiful. It eliminated the monstrous equant. It restored the Aristotelian ideal of uniform circular motion. The motivation was not purely scientific in the modern sense. It was a psychological need for elegance, a belief that truth and beauty were one and the same. Upon his return to the cold, wind-swept plains of Warmia, Copernicus did not retreat solely into the clouds. He was a true polymath practitioner, a man whose hands were stained with the ink of administration and the herbs of medicine. Though he never finished his medical degree, he became the primary physician for the elite of the bishopric, treating the ailments of high officials with a pragmatic blend of astrology and herbal remedies. He was grounded in the earth, deeply involved in the economics of the province. Decades before the English financier Thomas Gresham would articulate the principle, Copernicus observed that bad money drives out good. He formulated the quantity theory of money, arguing that the inflation plaguing the region was caused by an oversupply of debased currency. He understood that balance was required in the marketplace just as it was required in the heavens. His life was not without the clamour of war. In 1521, during the Polish-Teutonic War, the astronomer became a commander, put in charge of the defence of Olsztyn Castle. He found himself surrounded by the smoke of burning towns as the Teutonic knights ravaged the countryside. Copernicus did not flee. He organized the fortification, secured the food supply, and personally directed the resistance, holding the castle until the enemy retreated. The man who rearranged the solar system proved capable of holding the line on a muddy hill in Prussia. Yet, amidst the wars and the economics, there was a quiet, personal scandal that rippled through the clergy. For nearly a decade, the canon shared his home with a housekeeper named Anna Schilling. She was a presence of warmth in his solitary life, a companion who softened the edges of his isolation. But the intimacy of their arrangement drew the ire of the church. Bishop Dantiscus, a man of rigid propriety, admonished Copernicus twice, his letters dripping with ecclesiastical disappointment. Eventually the pressure became too great. Copernicus was forced to banish Anna from his residence, sending away the one person who perhaps understood the man beneath the astronomer's robes. Left alone once more, he retreated into the tower of his mind. By 1532, his masterwork, De Revolutionibus Orbium Coelestimif, was essentially complete. The manuscript sat on his desk, a stack of papers that contained the power to overturn the world. Yet he refused to publish it. He feared the ridicule of the foolish, the laughter of those who could not see the invisible geometry he had uncovered. He was content to let the secret die with him, to let the manuscript turn to dust in the shadows of his study. The silence might have won had it not been for a knock at the door in 1539. It was not a bishop or a soldier, but a young stranger from Wittenberg, Georg Horscher Joachim. Rothaticus was a 25-year-old mathematician, a Lutheran from the heart of the Reformation, arriving uninvited at the doorstep of a Catholic canon. He had heard whispers of the new astronomy and had travelled across dangerous lands to sit at the master's feet. Rothaticus brought with him a youthful, chaotic energy, a fanboy devotion that wore down the old man's resistance. He was the catalyst Copernicus needed. For 2 years, the young Protestant sat with the old Catholic, absorbing the radical logic of the heliocentric system, urging pleading and cajoling him to share this vision with the world. It was Theticus's sheer enthusiasm that finally pried the manuscript from Copernicus's hands. The decision was made. The book would be printed. The heavy wooden press in Nuremberg began to turn, stamping ink onto paper, pressing the new shape of the universe into existence. But as the pages were bound, the author's strength began to fade. The stroke that would claim him was already gathering like a storm front in his blood. History tells us that on his final day, May 24th, 1543, Nicolaus Copernicus lay in a coma, his breath shallow, his spirit hovering between the earth he had demoted and the heavens he had exalted. Legend holds that in his final conscious moment, the first printed copy of De Revolutionibus was placed into his trembling hands. He woke just long enough to see the leather binding, to feel the weight of his life's work, before closing his eyes forever. He left behind a world that still believed the earth was still. He left behind a church that would eventually condemn his work, and a scientific community that would take decades to fully grasp the torch he had lit. But the spark had been struck. The motionless earth had been set spinning, and the monstrous machinery of the past had been replaced by a silent, sun-centered perfection. As the candle flickered out in the chamber of the cannon of Warmia, the great wheels of the galaxy continued to turn, indifferent to the loss, yet irrevocably understood in a new light. The night sky over Bologna, over Toruń, over the whole of the human imagination, was waiting for the next pair of eyes to look up and see the ellipses hiding within the circles. To understand the silence that eventually fell over the cannon's chamber in Frombork, one must look back to the noise and vitality that preceded it, for the hands that finally let go of the leather-bound book were not merely the hands of an astronomer. They were the stained, practical hands of a physician, a diplomat, and a guardian of stone walls. Long before he was the ghost of the turret, staring into the dark, Nicolaus Copernicus was a man deeply entrenched in the messy, imperfect affairs of the earth. His journey into the healing arts began under the golden light of Italy, far from the grey mists of the Vistula. In the autumn of 1501, having already tasted the liberal arts in Krakow and the law in Bologna, a nearly 30-year-old Nicolaus arrived in Padua. This was the city of deep learning, a place where the air itself seemed heavy with the scent of dried herbs and ancient parchment. Here, the study of medicine was not a separate discipline from the study of the stars. They were twin branches of the same philosophy, entwined like the serpents on the caduceus. In the lecture halls of Padua, he learned that the human body was a microcosm, a miniature reflection of the great celestial macrocosm. To treat a fever, one had to understand the position of Mars. To drain the humours, one had to consult the phase of the moon. It was here, amidst the dissection tables and the botanical gardens, that the seed of his great dissatisfaction was watered. If the body required balance to survive a perfect equilibrium of blood, phlegm, and bile, then surely the heavens, the divine body of God's creation, required an even greater, more sublime symmetry. He never formally completed his medical degree in Padua, receiving his doctorate in canon law from Ferrara instead. Yet when he returned to the cold northern expanse of Warmia, he became known primarily as a healer. He was the medical pragmatist, the man to whom the powerful turned when their prayers went unanswered. For years he served as the personal physician to his uncle, the formidable Prince Bishop Lucas Watson Rhodes. He travelled the muddy roads of the bishopric, a bag of compounds and tinctures at his side, treating the ailments of the wealthy and the sorrows of the clergy. He was a physician of the old sort, mixing astrology with herbalism, prescribing crushed gemstones and roots, but observing his patients with the same detached, penetrating gaze. He turned toward the planets. He saw illness as a disorder, a chaotic deviation from the natural rhythm, much like the monstrous mathematical tricks of Ptolemy that so offended his sense of beauty. In the wheezing breath of a sick bishop, or the irregular pulse of a feverish cannon, Copernicus saw the same lack of elegance that plagued the geocentric model. He sought to cure the sky, just as he sought to cure the man, by finding the centre, the heart that pumped life into the system. But his art was not limited to the biological. The polymath's mind saw sickness in society as clearly as in the body. As he travelled through the market squares of Prussia, observing the exchange of goods, he diagnosed a different kind of malady and economic fever. He saw good silver coins being hoarded, melted down and spirited away, while debased, copper-heavy currency flooded the stalls. The common people were suffering, their wealth evaporating in their pockets as mints pumped out inferior coin. With the precision of a surgeon, he formulated a principle that would echo through economic history centuries before Thomas Gresham would claim it. "Bad money drives out good," he observed. He wrote treatises on the minting of coin, arguing that inflation was not a natural disaster, but a failure of supply, a sickness caused by an excess of currency. He argued for a single unified standard, a stable center around which the economy could revolve. Just as he would later place the sun at the center to stabilize the planets, he sought to place a stable currency at the center of the state to stabilize commerce. To Copernicus, whether it was a planet, a pulse, or a penny, the fundamental law was the same. Stability comes from a true and unmoving center. This desire for order was tested by fire in 1521, when the Teutonic Knights, seeking to reclaim their lost dominion, swept across the landscape, burning villages and laying siege to the towns. The astronomer, often depicted as a recluse in a tower, found himself the commander of Alston Castle. The stars were temporarily forgotten as he organized the defense, reinforcing the walls, counting the stockpiles of grain, and directing the placement of cannons. He proved to be a capable, stoic leader. While the fires of the Teutonic Order raged in the distance, turning the night sky an angry orange, Copernicus remained cool, writing letters to the King of Poland, demanding lead, powder, and men. He did not flee. He stood upon the ramparts, a man of 50, watching the horizon, not for the rising of Aldebaran, but for the banners of the enemy. He held the castle. The physician who tended to the weak had become the surgeon who cauterized the wound of invasion, holding the line until the truce was signed. Yet, amidst the wars and the economic reforms, there was a quieter, more personal struggle for symmetry. For all his intellectual rigor, Nicolaus was a man of solitude who craved a specific kind of order in his domestic life. This need manifested in the presence of Anna Schilling, a woman who lived in his house for nearly a decade. She was his housekeeper, but the intimacy of their arrangement scandalized the canons of the cathedral chapter. To the outside world, she was a distraction, a moral failing in a man of the cloth, but within the walls of his home she perhaps represented a grounding force, a tether to the mundane world of bread and linen that kept the stargazer from floating away entirely. She was the one who saw him not as the great administrator or the radical thinker, but as the aging man with ink-stained fingers and tired eyes. When the pressure from the church hierarchy became too great, when Bishop Dantiscus admonished him and ordered her banishment, Copernicus obeyed. He severed the tie, sending her away, choosing the silence of his work over the comfort of companionship. It was another amputation, another difficult cure applied to his own life to maintain the appearance of propriety, leaving him alone with his charts and his triangles. It was in this deepening solitude, stripped of his companion, relieved of his military duties, and retired from the worst of his medical rounds, that the physician turned his full attention to the ultimate patient, the universe itself. He looked at the Ptolemaic system, with its confused jumble of equants and epicycles, and he saw a terminal illness. The equant, that mathematical trick allowing planets to move at varying speeds, was to him a monstrous construction, a violation of the divine aesthetic. A perfect God would not build a clunky machine. A perfect God would build a symphony of perfect circles. He did not possess a telescope. He had only his eyes, his wooden triquetrum, and his obsession with elegance. He began to rearrange the cosmos, not because new data demanded it. His observations were largely the same as those of the ancients, but because his soul demanded it. He wanted the universe to be beautiful. He wanted the celestial ballet to follow a coherent choreography. By moving the sun to the center, the chaotic retrograde motions of Mars and Jupiter suddenly resolved into simple optical illusions caused by the Earth's own movement. The sickness of complexity was cured by the medicine of simplicity. The universe breathed a sigh of relief. The structure held. And so, the physician's art reached its zenith, not in the curing of a bishop's gout, nor in the defense of a castle, but in the healing of the world view. He prepared the manuscript, De Revolutionibus Orbium Caelestium, as a prescription for a humanity blinded by its own ego. He hesitated to publish, fearing the ridicule of those who could not see the beauty of his cure, keeping the remedy hidden in his study for years. It took the arrival of a young, vibrant mathematician, Rutheticus a Lutheran, who risked his own safety to seek out the Catholic canon, to finally pry the cure from the doctor's hands. Rutheticus saw the genius in the geometry, the daring in the stillness. He urged the old man to release his work, to let the world take the medicine it so desperately needed, even if it tasted bitter to the church and the scholars of the day. Thus, the stage was set for the final transition. The manuscript was sent to the printers in Nuremberg, the pages pressed with the ink that would rewrite the sky. Back in Frombork, the winter of 1542 brought a chill that settled deep in Copernicus's bones. The stroke came suddenly, a paralysis that mimicked the stillness he had assigned to the sun. He lay in his bed, the great mind dimming, waiting for the return of the work that had defined his existence. The snow melted, and the spring of 1543 arrived, bringing with it the courier from Nuremberg. The circle of his life was closing, returning to the point of origin, just as he had argued the planets must do. The physician could no longer heal himself. The economist could no longer count the cost. The commander could no longer hold the fort. All that remained was the astronomer, drifting in the space between the earth and the heavens, waiting for the heavy leather book to be placed upon his coverlet, a tangible anchor in a room that was beginning to spin. As the physical world began to recede, blurred by the haze of his failing health, the mind of Nicolaus Copernicus did not settle into darkness. Instead, it began to rotate, drifting backward against the current of time, returning to the solid earth from which he had risen. The stillness of the sick room in Frombork gave way to the rushing waters of the Vistula River, the lifeline of his childhood in Toruń. He was no longer the dying old man waiting for a printed book. He was once again Mikołaj, the boy born into the scent of copper and the bustle of trade. In the delirium of memory, the heavy metallic tang of the copper mines of his ancestors filled his lungs. His father, a merchant of prosperity and standing, loomed large in these early recollections, a pillar of stability that was too quickly toppled. Nicolaus remembered the sharp defining cold of his 10th year, a winter of the soul when his father was taken by the plague, leaving a silence in the house that no amount of wealth could fill. It was in this hollow space that his uncle, Lucas Watson-Road, stepped forward. Lucas was not a man of commerce, but a prince of the church, a figure of imposing will and sharp intellect who would eventually rise to become the Prince Bishop of Warmia. He took the orphaned boy and his brother under his wing, not merely to shelter them, but to mould them. The path laid out was one of service to the church, but the mind of young Nicolaus was a restless wanderer, unsuited for the static repetition of dogma. The memories shifted to the golden light of Italy, where the true awakening began. He saw himself walking the porticos of Bologna, a perpetual student in a world rediscovering the ancients. It was here, in the year 1496, that he moved into the home of Domenico Maria de Novara, the astronomer who dared to look at the sky with a critical eye. They stood together on a terrace in the cool Italian night, watching the moon eclipse the star Aldebaran. It was not just the observation that seared itself into Copernicus's memory, but the conversation, the quiet, dangerous whispers that Ptolemy, the great geometer of antiquity, might have been wrong. But it was not merely a matter of data. It was a matter of beauty. In the lecture halls of Padua and Ferrara, where he studied medicine and law, Copernicus found himself haunted by an aesthetic offence. He could not reconcile the chaotic complexity of the Ptolemaic system with the divine perfection he believed God must have instilled in the creation. The equant, pointer mathematical contrivance Ptolemy used to explain the varying speeds of planets revolted him. To Copernicus, it was a monstrous construction, a cheat that allowed the planets to violate the ancient rule of uniform circular motion. The universe he envisioned was a perfect machine, forged by a supreme artificer. And such a creator would never resort to clumsy tricks. He remembered the moment of clarity, a silent epiphany amidst the dust of old scrolls. If the sun were the lamp at the center of the temple, illuminating everything from a throne of stillness, the chaotic dance of the planets suddenly resolved into a graceful, orderly ballet. It was the desire for symmetry, not the pursuit of raw data, that first pushed the earth from the center of his mind. But the dreamer of celestial harmonies was also a man of the earth, bound by duty to the gritty realities of Warmia. The vision of the sun-scented cosmos faded, replaced by the grey stone walls of Ulstein Castle in the harsh winter of 1521. The narrative of his life was not solely written in ink, it was also written in gunpowder and stone. The memory was sharp and cold. The Polish-Teutonic War was raging, and the ruthless Teutonic knights were burning the villages surrounding Ulstein, their black crosses stark against the white snow. The other canons had fled, seeking safety deep within the Polish interior, but Copernicus had remained. He was the administrator, the physician, and now, by necessity, the commander, the gentle scholar, who spent his nights contemplating the silent music of the spheres, spent his days inspecting the integrity of the ramparts and counting barrels of grain. He could feel the rough parchment of the inventory lists under his gloved fingers, the weight of responsibility pressing down harder than the leaden skies. He wrote urgent letters to the King of Poland, demanding lead, salt, and arquebuses. He did not speak of stars. He spoke of survival. He remembered standing on the battlements as the smoke of burning farmsteads drifted over the walls, a man of 50 turning his mind from the infinite heavens to the finite, brutal geometry of a siege. He organized the defenses with the same precision he applied to his planetary tables. Every cannon placement was a calculation. Every ration of bread was a variable in an equation of endurance. When the knights approached the walls, expecting an easy victory over a scholar-led garrison, they found instead a fortress of iron will. The astronomer held the line. Ulstein did not fall. The smoke of the cannon fire cleared, revealing the later years, a time of quietude and shadows. The warrior astronomer retreated back to the cathedral precinct of Frombork, exchanging the sword for the pen, though his battles continued in other forms. He saw himself drafting treatises not on celestial mechanics, but on the mechanics of value. He argued against the debasement of currency, formulating the principle that bad money drives out good, realizing that just as the planets obeyed laws, so too did the flow of gold and silver. He was the physician of the elite, treating bishops and officials with herbal tinctures and astrological charts, his hands stained with the juices of medicinal plants. Yet, amidst the respect and the titles, there was a profound loneliness. The memory brought forth the image of Anna Schilling, the woman who had brought warmth to his cold stone house for nearly a decade. She was his housekeeper, but in the silence of his isolation, she had become his companion. The local clergy whispered. The scandal grew like a weed in the cracks of the church floor. Bishop Dantiscus, a man of rigid morality, admonished him once, then twice. Copernicus, the man who had defied the Teutonic Knights and rearranged the solar system, could not defy the church on this earthly matter. He remembered the heavy day he banished her from his home, the door closing on the only domestic comfort he had known, leaving him alone with his charts and his God. In that solitude, the great work, De Revolutionibus, sat in a chest, finished but hidden. He had completed the manuscript by 1532, yet fear held his hand. It was not merely the fear of persecution, but the fear of ridicule, that the world would laugh at the man who stopped the sun. For years, the pages gathered dust, the revolutionary truth imprisoned by the caution of its creator. Then came the knock at the door in 1539. It was not a bishop or a soldier, but a young man from Wittenberg, Georg Joachim Retheticus. He was a Lutheran, a heretic in the eyes of the Catholic canon, yet he came with a heart full of adoration for the new astronomy. Copernicus remembered the strange, invigorating energy of the 25-year-old mathematician. a fanboy whose enthusiasm cracked the shell of the old man's reticence. It was Rheticus who brought the precious gift of validation, who looked at the monstrous equant and agreed that it must go, who saw the beauty in the heliocentric model. It was Rheticus who convinced him that the truth belonged to the world, regardless of the laughter of fools. The memories began to accelerate, spinning faster, blurring into a singular point of white light. The young Rheticus departing with the manuscript, the long wait, the stroke that had paralyzed his right side in the winter of 1542. The circle was closing. The boy on the banks of the Vistula, the student in Bologna, the defender of Ulstein, the lover of Anna, the mentor of Rheticus, they all converged back into the frail body lying in the bed in Fromborg. The room ceased its spinning. The timeline had caught up to the present. The silence of the cathedral town was broken only by the sound of approaching footsteps in the corridor, heavy, deliberate steps carrying a burden of great import. The door creaked open, admitting a shaft of spring light that cut across the dim chamber. Copernicus, his eyes dim but his mind washed clean by the journey through his past, felt a weight being placed gently upon his coverlet. His fingers, trembling and numb, brushed against the cool, fresh leather of a newly bound book. The smell of ink and paper rose to meet him, a scent stronger than the copper mines, sweeter than the Italian night, more powerful than the gunpowder of Ulstein. He did not need to open it to know what it contained. He had stopped the sun, and in doing so, he had set the earth free. The weight of the volume resting against his chest was substantial, yet it felt lighter than the burdens he had carried for the better part of 70 years. The leather binding, cool and textured, summoned a sensory memory that predated the stars, a memory of the earth and the metals hidden within it. Before he was a canon of the cathedral, before he was a stargazer, he was the son of the Vistula River, born into a world of trade and tangible value. The scent of the book's hide brought him back to Toruń, to the prosperous house of his father, the merchant whose name, Copernicus, echoed the Slavic word for the very copper he traded. He remembered the dull gleam of the red metal in the candlelight of his childhood home, the clink of coins changing hands, the rhythm of commerce that flowed through the Hanseatic League. But the universe of his youth was fragile. At the age of 10, the anchoring gravity of his father vanished, leaving him an orphan in a bustling, indifferent world. It was his uncle, Lucas Watsenrode, a man of iron will and ecclesiastical ambition, who stepped into the void. Uncle Lucas, the Prince Bishop of Warmia, was a force of nature who sought to mould his nephew not into a dreamer, but into a weapon of the church. Under his uncle's stern guidance, Nicolaus became an academic wanderer, a collector of degrees who drifted from the liberal arts of Krakow to the canon law of Bologna and the medicine of Padua. He absorbed knowledge as the dry earth drinks rain, yet he never took the final vows of the priesthood, remaining always on the threshold, a cleric in spirit, but a man of the world in practice. It was this worldly practice that consumed his days, while the nights belonged to the stars. The history books would remember him for the celestial spheres, but the people of Warmia knew him as the pragmatic guardian of their earthly lives. The mind that reorganized the heavens was the same mind that organized the defense of Ulstein Castle. In the winter of 1521, when the Teutonic Knights swept through the countryside, burning villages and laying siege to the dominion, it was not a general who stood on the ramparts, but the quiet astronomer. Nicolaus laid aside his quadrants and picked up the mantle of command. With a calm mathematical precision, he calculated provisions, reinforced the walls, and directed the placement of cannons. He applied the same logic to the trajectory of a culverin shot as he did to the orbit of Mars, holding the castle against the fire and fury of the Teutonic Order until the spring thaw brought relief. But the ravages of war left a scar deeper than the burned timber of the villages. They left a chaotic economy. The coinage of Prussia had been debased, the silver diluted with copper until the currency was a mockery of value. It was here, in the dusty archives of the mint and the marketplace, that Copernicus became the alchemist of coin. He observed a phenomenon that others ignored, a principle as immutable as the rising sun. When bad money is introduced alongside good money, the good money is hoarded and disappears, leaving only the worthless currency to circulate. He sat at his desk, surrounded not by star charts but by ledgers of grain prices and minting ratios. Writing the treatise Monetae Cudendi Ratio, he argued that money, like the universe, required a stable center. To debase the coin was to rot the very foundation of society. He formulated the quantity theory of money centuries before the economists of the future would give it a name. Seeing clearly that an oversupply of currency inevitably led to the inflation that starved the poor, he sought symmetry in the marketplace, just as he sought it in the sky. To his eyes, a chaotic economy was as offensive as a disorderly planetary system. Both were violations of the divine elegance he believed underpinned all creation. This desire for elegance, for a perfect machine crafted by a supreme artificer, was the true north of his soul. It was what drove him to despise the equant, that monstrous mathematical trick Ptolemy used to account for the varying speeds of the planets. It was an ugly, limping device that offended Copernicus's aesthetic sense. The heavens must move in uniform circles. Anything less was a betrayal of the Creator's art. He shifted the sun to the center not merely because the math was easier, for indeed his own calculations were still tethered to ancient data, but because it was more beautiful. The celestial ballet required a choreographer, and Copernicus placed the burning lamp of the sun in the center of the stage to illuminate the dance of the spheres with a singular, symmetrical glory. Yet, for all his focus on the cold perfection of the spheres and the hard logic of the coin, there was a warmth in his life that the records often whispered, but rarely shouted. For nearly a decade, his home in Frombork was shared with Anna Schilling, a woman who was technically his housekeeper, but in truth was the companion of his heart. She brought a domestic rhythm to his isolated tower, a grounding presence that tethered the stargazer to the human experience. But the world of the 16th century had little patience for such irregularities. The scandal reached the ears of Bishop Dantiscus, a man who lacked the lenient wisdom of Copernicus's late uncle. Twice the bishop admonished him, and twice Copernicus resisted, until the pressure became a weight he could no longer bear. He was forced to banish Anna from his home, sending away the only person who truly knew the man behind the calculations. The silence she left behind was louder than the thunder of the Teutonic cannons. He filled that silence with his work as a physician, the medical pragmatist who treated the ailments of bishops and peasants alike. He blended the teachings of Galen with the positions of the stars, prescribing herbal remedies harvested from the gardens of the cathedral. He was a healer of bodies, a defender of castles, a stabilizer of currencies, and a painter who once captured his own likeness with a brush, preserving the sharp, contemplative features that now lay pale against the pillow. All these lives the orphan, the student, the commander, the economist, the lover, the physician had been lived in service of a single, unifying conviction that the world was not a random collection of accidents, but a coherent, harmonious whole. The chaotic wanderings of the planets, the fluctuation of bread prices, the health of the human body, all were puzzles waiting to be solved by the application of reason and the search for order. Now, as the light in the room began to shift, stretching the shadows of the bedposts across the stone floor, the disparate threads of his existence began to weave together. The copper of his father's trade, the silver of the coins he reformed, the iron of the cannons he commanded, and the ethereal light of the stars he worshipped, they all converged into the leather-bound book beneath his hand. The alchemist had finished his work. He had transmuted the leaden weight of a geocentric error into the gold of heliocentric truth. The coin of the cosmos was finally minted correctly, stamped with the image of the sun. His breathing slowed, catching the rhythm of a universe that no longer needed him to hold it together. The struggle for symmetry was over. The perfect machine was humming, independent of his pen, independent of his mind. The silence of the room deepened, becoming a vast, welcoming ocean, and the man who had moved the earth prepared to embark on his final static voyage into the center of the light. Yet, before the final cast-off, before the spirit could fully detach from the heavy, clay-like substance of mortality, The anchor of memory dragged one last time along the seabed of his life. The silence of the room was profound, but the mind of Nicolaus Copernicus was not yet empty. It was crowded with the echoes of a world he had tried so hard to organize, a world that was far messier, far louder, and far more demanding than the crystalline spheres he had mapped in the heavens. The perfect machine of the universe hung above him, serene and untouched, but down here, in the mud and the stone of Warmia, his life had been a series of terrestrial obligations, a constant friction between the ideal and the real. His thoughts drifted back from the edge of eternity to the smell of ink and copper. He remembered the weight of coins in his hand, not as a miser, but as a physician of the economy. Long before he had diagnosed the sickness of the planetary models, he had diagnosed the sickness of Poland's currency. He recalled the dusty council rooms where he had argued, with the same precision he applied to the stars, that bad money drives out good. He had seen how the debased coins, mixed with copper and stripped of silver, were hoarded while the pure currency vanished, a terrestrial chaos that mirrored the confusing loops of the planets. He was the son of a merchant, the orphan of the Vistula, and the copper of his father's trade ran in his veins just as surely as the starlight filled his eyes. He had been a man of the earth, tasked with fixing the prices of bread and the weight of a penny, trying to impose order on the chaotic markets of men, while his mind yearned for the silent order of the spheres. The memories shifted, the scene changing from the counting house to the cold, wind-battered ramparts of Ulstein Castle. The astronomer saw himself not in robes, but in the heavy wool of a commander. It was the winter of 1521, and the Teutonic Knights were burning the villages of Warmia, their fires painting jagged orange scars against the night sky. He had not fled. The quiet canon, the man who dreamed of a sun-scented cosmos, had stood firm on the walls, organizing the defense, counting the stores of gunpowder and grain with the same meticulous care he used to chart the lunar occultations. He remembered the sound of the cannons, the iron thunder that shook the stone beneath his feet, a brutal earthly percussion that was the antithesis of the celestial harmony he sought. He had protected his people, holding the line against the chaos of war, proving that the mind which could dismantle the heavens could also fortify a castle. But the most persistent memory, the one that lingered with a melancholy sweetness as the shadows in the room lengthened, was not of war, nor of money, nor even of the stars. It was the memory of a presence, the memory of a voice that had once filled the silence of his study, of a hand that had placed a plate of warm food beside his charts, the memory of Anna Schilling. For nearly a decade she had been his housekeeper, living within the walls of his home in Frombork. In the solitary, austere life of a canon, she had been the one note of domestic warmth, a grounding force in a life spent looking upward. To the world she was a servant, to the local gossip she was a scandal, but to the aging astronomer she was a companion who understood the rhythms of his solitude. They had shared the same roof, the same meals, the same quiet evenings while the wind howled off the lagoon. But the earth, in its rigid, dogmatic rotation, could not tolerate such an undefined orbit. The memory brought a phantom pain, a tightening in the chest that had nothing to do with his failing heart. He remembered the letters from Bishop Dantiscus, heavy with wax seals and admonitions. The church that sustained him, the uncle who had raised him, the institution that gave him the tower from which to watch the sky at, now demanded the removal of the one human comfort he possessed. The bishop had called it a scandal, whispering of impropriety, demanding that the housekeeper be banished. Copernicus, the man who had dared to move the earth, had found himself unable to move the mind of a bishop. He had bowed his head. He had sent her away. The house had grown quiet again, a sterile, hollow silence that no amount of calculation could fill. He had learned then that the gravity of social expectation was a force far harder to overcome than the gravity of the earth. He had returned to his solitary work, the self-portrait of a lonely man painting his own visage in the mirror, capturing the sharp, piercing eyes that saw everything in the heavens but could keep nothing on the ground. And then, into that void, a new energy had arrived, uninvited and vibrating with the dangerous thrill of the forbidden. The memory of Georg Joachim Theticus washed over him, a young man, a Lutheran, a heretic in the eyes of the Catholic hierarchy, knocking at the door of the canon of Warmia. It was an impossible meeting, a conjunction of opposites that should have resulted in conflict. Instead, it had birthed the final courage. Copernicus saw the young mathematician's face, alight with a fanboy devotion, his eyes widening as he read the manuscript that had gathered dust for years. Theticus was the spark. He was the youthful fire that thawed the old man's frozen caution. Without Theticus, the De Revolutionibus would have remained a stack of parchment, a secret theory buried in a grave. The young man had taken the risk, carrying the wisdom of the old master across the dangerous borders of a divided Europe to the printing presses of Nuremberg. The timeline of his life collapsed now, folding in on itself like a closing book. The copper merchant, the student of Bologna, the physician of Padua, the defender of Olstein, the lover of a banished woman, the reluctant revolutionary, they all merged into the frail body lying in the bed in Frombork. The stroke had taken his speech, leaving him trapped within the fortress of his own mind, a final, silent observatory. He could feel the cold creeping up his limbs, the slow cessation of the internal machinery. But then a sensation, a tactile reality breaking through the numbness. He felt a weight being placed upon his chest. It was not the heavy, crushing weight of guilt or duty, nor the leaden weight of the geocentric error. It was a solid, rectangular object. His fingers, trembling and weak, brushed against the texture of fresh leather. The smell of new paper and binding glue drifted to his nose, sharper than the scent of medicine incense. He did not need to open his eyes to know what it was. It was the harvest of his life. It was the De Revolutionibus Orbium Coelestium. Theticus had kept his promise. The pages were printed. The diagrams were inked. The secret was out. The earth was no longer the heavy, sludge-filled sump of the universe, motionless and dull. It was a planet. It was a star among stars, spinning, dancing, flying through the ether with a grace that had always been there, waiting for him to see it. The monstrous equant was gone. The spheres were sliding into their perfect, uniform paths. The supreme artificer's design was finally revealed, not as a clumsy contraption, but as a temple of supreme elegance. The symmetry was complete. Nicolaus Copernicus took a shallow breath, inhaling the scent of the book that rested on his heart. The fear of the church, the pain of the lost housekeeper, the exhaustion of the war, it all dissolved into the great white light of the sun he had placed on the throne. He was no longer holding the world together. He was letting it spin. The static voyage was over. The true motion had begun, and as the final darkness closed in, it was not an end, but a sunrise, blinding and eternal, rising not around him, but from within him, as the man who stopped the sun finally allowed himself to join its light. But to understand the perfection of that final silence, to understand how a single mind could dismantle the heavens and rebuild them in a shape of such terrifying elegance, one must leave the light of the stars and descend back into the heavy, shadowed fog of the beginning. The journey toward the stationary sun began in the cold damp of the north, in a world that was still firmly, stubbornly fixed at the center of the universe. It began with a boy named Nicolaus, born in the winter of 1473 in the red-brick merchant town of Toruń, Severy, where the Vistula River carved its way through the Polish plains like a vein of dark silver. He was the son of copper, the metal of Venus, the metal that turned green with time and weather. His father was a merchant of this prosperous trade, and the family name, Copernic, whispered of the village of Koperniki and the deep subterranean mines from which the ore was torn. The air of his childhood was thick with the scent of river mud and the metallic tang of his father's warehouse, a grounded, material existence that gave no hint of the celestial mechanics that would one day consume him. But the universe, in its indifferent rotation, brought an early eclipse to his life. When Nicolaus was only 10 years old, the father who had anchored his world vanished into death, leaving a void that could not be filled by copper or coin. Into this space stepped a figure of immense and imposing gravity, his maternal uncle, Lucas Watsonrode. Uncle Lucas was not merely a guardian. He was a force of nature, a man of iron will and ecclesiastical ambition, who would soon rise to become the Prince Bishop of Warmia. He was a man who moved through the world with the certainty of a planet in its track, and he swept the young orphan into his orbit with a plan already fully formed. The boy was to be groomed for the church, destined for power and stability, sheltered under the heavy velvet robes of the bishopric. Yet the mind of the young Copernicus was not one to settle easily into a preordained mould. Under his uncle's patronage, he became an academic wanderer, a perpetual student, drifting through the great intellectual capitals of Europe, like a comet seeking a trajectory. For over a decade, he collected knowledge with a hunger that bordered on the obsessive, yet he remained elusive, never fully committing to the priesthood that Watsonrode envisioned. He travelled to Krakow to master the liberal arts, breathing in the first whispers of astronomy. He crossed the Alps to Bologna to study canon law, then to Padua for medicine, and finally to Ferrara, where he received a doctorate in law. He was a man of parts lawyer, physician, scholar, yet he was ordained by none of them. He was a polymath in search of a unifying theory, a mind that sensed the edges of a great puzzle but could not yet see the picture. It was in Bologna in the year 1496 that the first crack in the crystal spheres appeared. He was 23 years old, living in the home of the astronomer Domenico Maria de Novara. Novara was not a man who simply read the ancients. He was a man who dared to look up and question them. In the cool blue nights of Italy, far from the fog of the Vistula, Copernicus stood beside his mentor on the rooftops, their eyes tracing the slow, silent ballet of the lights above. Together, they observed a lunar occultation of the star Aldebaran in 1497. As they watched the dark edge of the moon swallow the bright red eye of the bull, Copernicus felt a tremor of doubt that had nothing to do with the cold. The measurements did not fit. The moon's distance, its size, its speed. If one strictly followed the great Ptolemy, the moon should have appeared twice as large at certain times of the month, a swelling giant that never materialized. The math was right, but the reality was wrong. The universe was singing a song, but the sheet music the ancients had written was full of discordant notes. This dissonance followed him back to the north. When he finally returned to Warmia, he did not retire into the quiet life of a cloistered astronomer. The world would not let him. In the harsh, frozen winters of the early 16th century, the astronomer became a man of war and stone. When the Teutonic knights, clad in their white mantles and black crosses, surged across the borders, burning villages and laying siege to the lands of the bishopric, it was Copernicus who stood at the walls. In 1521, he was placed in command of the defence of Olstein Castle. The man who dreamed of celestial harmony found himself organizing the rationing of bread, the placement of cannons, and the morale of terrified soldiers. He proved to be a capable, pragmatic commander, holding the castle against the burning tide of the knights. It was here, amidst the smoke and the starving crowds, that he applied his mind to the flow of earthly things. He observed how the influx of debased currency coins mixed with cheaper metals drove the good, pure gold and silver out of circulation. Decades before Thomas Gresham would give it a name, Copernicus formulated the law that bad money drives out good, and argued that inflation was a scourge caused by the oversupply of currency. He understood systems. He understood that whether it was the orbit of Mars or the circulation of the grows, a system required balance to survive. But beneath the armor of the administrator and the robes of the physician, for he was also the primary doctor to the bishops, treating them with a blend of herbalism and astrological timing, there lay a secret life. It was a life of quiet scandal and hidden beauty. For nearly 10 years, he shared his home with a housekeeper named Anna Schilling, a woman whose presence was so distressing to the rigid morality of the church that Bishop Dantiscus sent admonishment after admonishment. Copernicus, the man who would challenge the structure of the heavens, struggled to defend the structure of his own heart, eventually forced to banish her from his house, leaving him once again in the solitude of his tower. In that solitude, the true obsession took hold. It was not merely that the Ptolemaic system was inaccurate, it was that it was ugly. The deepest offense to Copernicus's soul was a mathematical device known as the equant. Ptolemy, in his attempt to explain why planets appeared to speed up and slow down, had created a theoretical point in space, the equant, around which a planet moved uniformly, but it did not move uniformly around the center of its circle. It was a cheat. It was a monstrous construction, a clumsy, staggering gear in what should have been a divine clockwork. Copernicus believed in the supreme artificer. He believed that the creator of the universe was a geometer of infinite perfection. A perfect God would not use a monstrous equant. A perfect God would move the spheres in perfect uniform circles, an eternal, unwavering dance. The current model was a clashing, grinding machine of epicicles and imaginary points, a beggar's coat patched together with conflicting math. He yearned for elegance. He hungered for symmetry. He did not move the sun to the center because he had better telescopes. He had none. He did not do it because his data was superior. He used the same dusty observations as the ancients. He moved the sun because it was the only way to heal the wound in the sky. By placing the burning lamp of the world in the center, the monstrous equant vanished. The planets fell into an orderly line. Mercury, Venus, Earth, Mars, Jupiter, Saturn, their speeds were no longer arbitrary mysteries, but a function of their distance from the hearth of the sun. It was beautiful, and because it was beautiful, he knew it must be true. He painted this truth in his mind, just as he painted his own face in a self-portrait kept in his study, a record of a man looking closely at himself and the world. But for decades, the book that contained this revelation, De Revolutionibus, lay locked in a chest, a dangerous secret. He was afraid, not of persecution, but of ridicule. He feared being the man who claimed the floor was moving. It was not until the twilight of his life, in 1539, that the final catalyst arrived. A young, energetic mathematician named Georg Joachim Rethecus, a Lutheran from Wittenberg, arrived uninvited at the Catholic canon's door. He was 25, brimming with fanboy devotion, risking heresy to learn from the Wizard of the North. It was the enthusiasm of this young stranger, who saw the beauty that Copernicus had guarded for so long, that finally pried the manuscript from the old man's hands. The ink was wet. The presses in Nuremberg began to turn. The monstrous equant was dead, slain by the stroke of a pen and the courage of an old man who simply wanted the universe to be as perfect as he dreamed it. And as the pages were bound, the great celestial clock ticked toward its final alignment, preparing to release its watchman from his post. The static earth was ready to spin. To understand the silence of the tower where the old canon finally rested, one must first navigate the currents of the river that carried him there. Long before the printing presses in Nuremberg began their rhythmic clatter, and long before the world braced itself to move, there was only a boy standing on the banks of the Vistula, in the merchant city of Toruń. He was born Nicolaus Copernicus, a name tasting of the earth itself, likely drawn from the village of Koperniki, where the copper mines scarred the land. The scent of that metal sharp, metallic, and conductive filled his early years. For his father was a prosperous merchant in the trade, but the stability of copper is an illusion. It corrodes, it changes, just as life does. When Nicolaus was only 10 years old, the anchor of his world was severed. His father died, leaving a void that was quickly filled by the imposing shadow of his maternal uncle, Lucas Watson-Rode. This was no ordinary guardian. Watson-Rode was a prince of the church, the future Bishop of Warmia. A man of steel will and political maneuvering who viewed the young Nicolaus not merely as a nephew, but as clay to be moulded. The uncle's vision was clear. The boy would serve the church. And so began the decades of the academic wanderer, a pilgrimage of the mind that would take him far from the grey skies of Poland to the golden light of Italy. He became a perpetual student, a collector of wisdom who drifted between the great universities of Europe for over a decade. In Krakow, he absorbed the liberal arts. In Bologna, he immersed himself in canon law. In Padua, he studied the healing arts of medicine. And in Ferrara, he finally took the doctorate in law. Yet, in all those years of ecclesiastical grooming, he never took the final vows of a priest. He remained on the threshold, a canon, a man of the cloth, but also a man of the world, forever balancing between the sacred and the secular. It was in Bologna, under the roof of the astronomer Domenico Maria de Novara, that the true architecture of his mind began to take shape. Novara was not a man to blindly accept the dust of antiquity. He dared to challenge the ancients, and Nicolaus became his willing apprentice. Together, on cool Italian nights in 1497, they watched the moon occult the star, Aldebaran. In the silence of that observation, seeing the celestial bodies dance in ways that the old charts could not perfectly explain, the first seeds of a quiet rebellion were sown. Nicolaus began to suspect that the great Ptolemy, the geographer of the heavens, had built a house on shifting sand. But Copernicus was not merely a stargazer lost in the abstract. When he returned to the cold northern plains of Warmia, he lived the life of a true Renaissance practitioner. He was a physician, tending to the ailments of the elite, mixing astrology with herbalism to treat the bishops and officials who governed the land. He was an economist, observing the flow of currency with the same keen eye he turned to the planets. Decades before the financiers of London would give it a name, Copernicus realized that bad money drives out good, formulating the theories of inflation that would govern empires. And he was a soldier. In 1521, when the fires of the Polish-Teutonic War raged, the astronomer did not hide in his observatory. He was placed in command of the defense of Ulstein Castle. As the Teutonic Knights burned the surrounding villages, turning the winter sky into a canvas of orange and black smoke, Copernicus organized the fortification. He managed the grain, directed the artillery, and held the walls. The man who would one day move the sun first had to stand his ground against the armies of men. Yet, amidst the wars and the politics, amidst the scandalous whispers regarding his housekeeper, Anna shilling a companionship that brought him comfort, but drew the ire of his superiors, Nicolaus retreated night after night to his true sanctuary. He withdrew to the tower in Frombork, a lonely spire overlooking the Vistula lagoon. Here, surrounded by his instruments and his own painted self-portrait, he waged a different kind of war. This was a battle against ugliness. Modern minds might suspect he sought scientific truth, but his motivation was far more artistic. Copernicus was offended by the equant, a mathematical trick used by Ptolemy to explain the erratic speed of the planets. It required the planets to move uniformly around a point that was not the center of their orbit. To Copernicus, this was a monstrous construction, a clumsy jaggedness in what should be a divine ballet. He believed in a supreme artificer, a creator who would not build a universe of clunky gears and cheating mathematics. He sought symmetry. He sought elegance, by placing the sun at the center, not because the data demanded it, but because the aesthetic demanded it. The celestial ballet suddenly resolved into a harmonious, uniform circle. The universe became a perfect machine. He held this secret in the tower for decades, guarding the manuscript of De Revolutionibus like a jealous lover. It was finished by 1532, yet it sat gathering dust, hidden from the world, until the arrival of the young Rheticus broke the seal. The enthusiasm of the young Lutheran gave the old Catholic the courage to release his life's work. The end came in the spring of 1539. The great mind that had travelled from the copper mines of Toruń to the battlements of Ulstein was fading. A stroke had left him in a coma, drifting in the grey space between this world and the spheres he had mapped. Legend tells us that on May 24, 1543, as he lay on his deathbed in Frombork, the first printed copy of his book arrived from Nuremberg. The pages, smelling of fresh ink and new ideas, were gently placed into his hands. He awoke, if only for a fleeting moment. His fingers brushed the leather binding, feeling the weight of the revolution he had authored. He looked upon the work that declared the earth was merely a wanderer among the stars, no longer the center of all things. The fear of ridicule was gone. The wars were over. The scandalous whispers were silenced. There was only the geometry of the spheres, perfect and divine. He closed his eyes, exhaling a final breath that belonged to a new universe, and the watchman left his post, allowing the static earth to finally and beautifully spin. As the candle in the death chamber flickered and died, the light of the Renaissance began to burn with a new and terrifying brilliance, illuminating a path for the giants who would soon follow in the wake of the cannon from Warmia. To understand the sheer improbability of that final, peaceful moment in Frombork where a dying man held the sum of his life's work in his trembling hands, one must look back 4 years, to a time when the manuscript lay gathering dust in a dark corner of the cathedral tower, destined for oblivion. The silence of the universe was almost maintained. The secret of the sun's true place was nearly buried in the grave, along with the old canon who had discovered it. That the book existed at all was not due to the astronomer himself, but to an uninvited guest, a stranger who rode out of the mists of the south with the fervour of a pilgrim and the dangerous curiosity of a revolutionary. It was the spring of 1539, and Europe was a fractured continent, torn apart by the violent theological storms of the Reformation. Martin Luther had nailed his theses to the door in Wittenberg 2 decades prior, and the chasm between Catholic and Protestant had become a war zone of ideology. It was illegal, and often fatal, for a scholar from the Lutheran stronghold of Wittenberg to travel into the staunchly Catholic bishopric of Warmia. Yet, along the muddy, rutted roads leading to the Baltic coast, a young mathematician named Georg Joachim Retheticus urged his horse forward. He was only 25 years old, brimming with the restless energy of the New Age. He had heard whispers of a phantom scholar in the north, a recluse named Copernicus, who was rumoured to have stopped the sun and moved the earth. To Retheticus, these rumours were not heresy, they were a siren song. He risked imprisonment and the charge of treason simply by crossing the border, carrying with him nothing but a few gifts of books and a burning desire to know the truth. When he finally arrived at the gates of Frombork, the fortress cathedral rising like a brick sentinel against the grey waters of the lagoon, he was not met with fanfare, but with the wary suspicion of an old man who had spent a lifetime learning the value of silence. Nicolaus Copernicus was 66, 4 decades senior to this enthusiastic intruder. He was a man of the previous century, cautious, conservative, and deeply afraid of the ridicule that his radical ideas might invite. He had watched the stars for 40 years, but he had watched the political winds for just as long. When Retheticus knocked on his door, Copernicus saw a liability. Here was a Lutheran, a professor from the very university that the Church deemed a viper's nest of heresy. And yet there was something in the young man's eyes of pure, unadulterated reverence for geometry that disarmed the old canon. For the first time in his solitary life, Copernicus found a kindred spirit. What followed was one of the most remarkable and unlikely friendships in the history of science. For 2 years, the young Protestant and the old Catholic lived side by side in the brick tower. Retheticus became the disciple Copernicus never knew he needed. He was the catalyst, the spark that reignited the fading embers of the astronomer's ambition. They spent long nights in the observatory, the pavimentum, surrounded by quadrants and triquetrums, breathing in the cold, salty air of the Vistula lagoon. It was Retheticus who was allowed to open the chest and lift out the heavy stack of papers that comprised De Revolutionibus Orbium Coelestium. As he read, the young mathematician was entranced. He saw past the density of the calculations to the elegant, terrifying beauty of the system. He saw the monstrous equant of Ptolemy banished, replaced by a celestial ballet of perfect circles where the planets glided with a uniform dignity around the burning throne of the sun. He realized that the old man had not merely adjusted the calendar, he had dismantled the architecture of reality. But Copernicus remained obstinate. He feared the hissing of the crowd. He feared that the mathematicians would laugh at him and that the theologians would condemn him. It took the relentless youthful pressure of Retheticus to erode this resistance. The disciple wrote a summary, the Narratio Prima, a first report sent out to the intellectuals of Europe as a test balloon. When the world did not immediately explode in outrage, but rather responded with intrigued murmurs, Copernicus finally, hesitantly, relented. He handed the manuscript to Rutheticus, entrusting his life's work to the hands of the young Lutheran, allowing it to be taken away to the printing presses of Nuremberg. The journey of the manuscript was as perilous as the theory it contained. Rutheticus carried the papers like a holy relic, navigating the treacherous political landscape to the workshop of Johannes Petraeus, a master printer known for his skill with scientific texts. In Nuremberg, the smell of oil and crushed rags filled the air as the typesetters began the laborious process of carving the new universe into lead and ink. Rutheticus oversaw the initial stages, correcting proofs with the obsession of a guardian. But fate and the duties of his own university career eventually pulled him away to Leipzig, forcing him to leave the final supervision of the printing to a local Lutheran theologian named Andreas Osiander. This transfer of guardianship proved to be the final bitter twist in the saga. Osiander, fearful that the book would be attacked as blasphemy, made a decision that would confuse readers for generations. Without asking permission and without signing his name, he removed Copernicus's original preface and inserted an anonymous address to the reader. In this unauthorized foreword, Osiander claimed that the heliocentric theory was not a description of physical reality, but merely a mathematical hypothesis, a convenient fiction designed to make calculations easier. He tried to soften the blow, to cloak the revolution in the safety of abstraction. When Rutheticus later received the printed book and saw the betrayal, he was apoplectic with rage. He took a red crayon and violently crossed out the unauthorized preface in every copy he could find, slashing through the lies that tried to tame the wild truth of the text. But the ink was dry. The book was born. It was this volume, with its revolutionary core wrapped in a cautious lie, that made its way back north, carried by messengers over the spring roads, racing against the fading pulse of its author. The arrival of the book in Frombork was the closing of the circle. The Lutheran disciple had succeeded where the master had hesitated. He had dragged the sun to the center of the solar system and pinned it there with the weight of the printing press. Copernicus, in his final moments, may not have known of the unauthorized preface, or perhaps, in the fog of his departure, it no longer mattered. The physical object was real. The geometry was loose in the world. The death of the author was merely the beginning of the book's life. For a long time it sat on library shelves, a book that nobody read, known only to a small circle of mathematical adepts. It was dense, difficult, and technically demanding. To the casual observer, the world still looked the same. The sun still seemed to rise and set, and the earth felt solid beneath their feet. The revolution did not happen with a bang, but with a slow subterranean rumble. The Lutheran disciple had planted a seed in the bedrock of history, a seed that would lie dormant through the winters of indifference, waiting for the next generation of giants to water it. The silence that fell over the cathedral in Frombork after the funeral was deceptive. The body of the canon was lowered into a grave beneath the floor of the cathedral, unmarked and humble, but above him, in the high vault of the intellectual heavens, the gears had begun to turn in reverse. The static earth had been set in motion, and as the 16th century began to wane, the book waited. It waited for eyes that could see past the Osiander preface. It waited for a Danish nobleman with a golden nose who would chart the skies with unprecedented precision, and for an Italian mathematician who would turn a spyglass toward the heavens and see the truth with his own eyes. The story of the lonely canon was over, but the story of the cosmos was just beginning to unfold. The stage was set, the script was written, and the actors who would play the next parts in this grand drama were already being born, unknowingly preparing to step into the light that Nicolaus Copernicus had struck in the dark. But to understand the silence of the cathedral and the weight of the book that lay upon the canon's deathbed, we must turn back the clock, reversing the celestial spheres until we arrive not at an ending, but at a beginning. Before the revolution, before the heresy, and before the silence, there was simply a boy standing on the banks of the Vistula River. The story of the cosmos was rewritten not by a ghost, but by a man of flesh, blood, and profound contradictions, a man whose life was as intricate as the clockwork heavens he sought to explain. He was born Nicolaus Copernicus on a shivering February day in 1473 in the brick-laden city of Toruń. The air he breathed was thick with the scent of commerce and the dust of the road, for his father was a prosperous merchant dealing in copper, a metal that gave the family its very name, derived from the village of Koperniki and its mines. The young Nicolaus did not grow up looking at the stars with a mystic's eye. He grew up watching the flow of goods along the river, understanding the weight of coins and the value of tangible things. But the security of this merchant life was fragile. When Nicolaus was only 10 years old, the anchor of his world was severed. His father died, leaving the family adrift, only to be caught by the formidable grip of his maternal uncle Lucas Watson Rhodes. Watson Rhodes was no mere guardian. He was a titan of the church, soon to become the Prince Bishop of Warmia. He was a man of steel and ambition, who saw in his young nephew not just a boy, but a vessel to be filled with influence and power. Under the shadow of his uncle's mitre, Nicolaus was groomed for the ecclesiastical aristocracy. Yet the path to the priesthood became a winding road that Nicolaus travelled for over a decade without ever arriving at the final destination. He became the eternal scholar, the academic wanderer of Europe. He drifted from the liberal arts in Krakow to the lecture halls of Bologna, where he studied canon law, and then to Padua for medicine, finally seizing a doctorate in law from Ferrara. He collected knowledge like a magpie, yet he never took the holy orders of a priest. He remained a canon, a man on the threshold, standing between the sacred and the secular. It was in the humid heat of Bologna, in the year 1496, that the true turning point occurred. He took lodging in the home of the astronomer Domenico Maria di Novara. Novara was not a man who simply read the ancients. He dared to question them. Together, the student and the master stood on the roof tiles, watching the night sky, their breath misting in the cold air. In 1497, they observed the moon eclipsing the star Aldebaran, a celestial occultation that whispered a secret. The distance of the moon did not match the predictions of Ptolemy. It was here that the seed of doubt was planted, not a doubt born of heresy, but of aesthetics. To the modern mind, science is a pursuit of cold data, but for Copernicus, the motivation was art. He was a man obsessed with symmetry. As he studied the Ptolemaic system that had governed astronomy for over a millennium, he did not see majesty, he saw a mess. He was deeply disturbed by the equant, a mathematical cheat used by Ptolemy to explain the varying speeds of planets. To Copernicus, the idea that a planet would wobble in its speed was a monstrous construction, a violation of the divine order. He believed the universe was a perfect machine crafted by a supreme artificer, and such a creator would never resort to clumsy tricks. He moved the sun to the center not because he had better telescopes. He had none, but because it made the celestial ballet beautiful. He sought elegance in the geometry of God. Yet this dreamer of perfect circles was also a man of gritty reality. Far from the caricature of the cloistered stargazer, Copernicus was a polymath practitioner who lived with his hands in the dirt and blood of his era. When he returned to Warmia, he served as a diplomat and a physician, treating the ailments of bishops with a pragmatic mix of astrology and herbalism. He was an economist who understood the flow of currency better than the kings of his time, formulating the principle that bad money drives out good. Decades before it was named Gresham's Law, he argued that inflation was a scourge caused by the oversupply of coins, applying the same mathematical rigor to the gold in a man's pocket as he did to the stars in the sky. There was fire in him, too. In 1520, as the Teutonic Knights ravaged the countryside, burning towns and threatening the sovereignty of the region, the astronomer became a commander. He was placed in charge of the defense of Olstein Castle. While others fled, Copernicus stayed. He organized the fortifications, managed the food supplies, and personally directed the resistance against the siege. The man who would displace the earth also knew how to hold his ground upon it, but for all his public strength, his private life held its own quiet scandals. For nearly a decade, the canon shared his home with a woman named Anna Schilling, officially his housekeeper. She was the source of whispers and admonishments from the clergy. Bishop Dantiscus, a man of rigid morals, sent warning after warning, eventually forcing Copernicus to banish her from his house. It was a humanizing chapter in a life often stripped of emotion, revealing a man who sought companionship in the long, cold nights of the Baltic coast. By 1532 his great manuscript, De Revolutionibus, was complete, yet it lay gathering dust in his study. He refused to publish it, fearing not the persecution of the church but the mockery of the schools. He feared being the fool who claimed the earth moved. The work might have died with him, buried in that unmarked grave, had it not been for the arrival of an uninvited guest. In 1539, a young mathematician named Georg Joachim Rethetikus knocked on his door. He was a Lutheran, a man from the opposing side of the religious schism tearing Europe apart. Yet he came as a disciple. Rethetikus possessed a youthful, fanatical devotion to Copernicus's ideas. He brought the energy that the aging astronomer lacked. It was this fanboy zeal that finally coaxed the manuscript out of the shadows and into the printing press. The end came in 1543. Legend tells us that Copernicus lay in a coma, struck down by a stroke, his body failing as the first printed copy of his life's work was raced to his bedside. The pages were damp with fresh ink, bound in the leather that would carry his heresy into the future. They placed the book in his hands. He is said to have awoken for a fleeting moment, his eyes resting on the title page before breathing his last. But even in death, the truth was veiled. At the front of the book sat an anonymous preface, written by the theologian Andreas Osiander without Copernicus's permission. This preface of lies claimed that the heliocentric theory was merely a mathematical hypothesis, a fiction to aid calculation, not a description of reality. It was a final act of obfuscation, a veil thrown over the sun. The world was told it was only a story, but the machinery had already been set in motion, and no preface could stop the turning of the spheres. The gears of the heavens do not pause for the hesitation of men, nor do they halt for the silencing of a single voice. When Nicolaus Copernicus breathed his last on that spring day in 1543, the book resting on his coverlet was technically finished, yet the revolution it contained was only just beginning its long, slow ascent. The cathedral canon, the doctor of the poor, the reluctant revolutionary, had departed, leaving behind a world that still believed itself to be the unmoving anchor of all creation. He was buried with the modest rites of a cleric, lowered into the crypt beneath the brick floor of Frombork Cathedral. There was no grand monument, no marble statue pointing defiantly at the sun. He was laid to rest near the altar of the Holy Cross, indistinguishable from the other canons who had served the chapter before him. For centuries his bones lay in anonymity, lost beneath the shuffling feet of the faithful, while above him the sun continued to rise and set in the eyes of the world, unaware that its status had been irrevocably changed. The book, De Revolutionibus Orbium Curistium, travelled out of the sick room and into the libraries of Europe, carried by the very networks of correspondence Copernicus had maintained throughout his life. At first, it did not cause the explosion one might expect. The preface of lies, inserted by the theologian Osiander, did its work all too well. It acted as a sedative, lulling the church authorities into believing that this sun-centered system was merely a mathematical game, a convenient abstraction for calculating dates and holidays, rather than a claim to physical truth. The book was not immediately banned, it was simply misunderstood. It sat on high shelves gathering the dust of the 16th century, its dangerous geometry hidden in plain sight. Yet truth is a patient gardener. The seed Copernicus had planted in the soil of the profound silence of Frombork began to germinate in minds far younger and more radical than his own. He had been driven by a desire for aesthetic purity, disturbed by the monstrous complexity of the old Ptolemaic system. He had sought the elegance of the supreme artificer, believing that the universe must be a perfect machine. He had not possessed a telescope. He had not seen the moons of Jupiter or the phases of Venus. He had only his logic, his mathematics, and his deep, abiding faith that the cosmos was beautiful. It would take decades for the sleepwalker's revolution to fully wake. The Italian with the spyglass, Galileo, would eventually look up and see the confirmation of what the quiet Polish canon had sketched by candlelight. The German mathematician Kepler would take the circles Copernicus so loved and stretch them into ellipses, finally shattering the crystal spheres and perfecting the celestial ballet. They were the architects who built upon the foundation Copernicus had laid in solitude. They vindicated the man who had spent his life wondering if he was the only one who could see the symmetry of the spheres. But before the vindication of the astronomer, there was the legacy of the man. Nicolaus Copernicus had been more than a stargazer. He was a man of the earth, deeply entrenched in the practical realities of human life. He had walked the ramparts of Ulstein Castle, commanding its defense against the Teutonic Knights, proving that the mind that contemplated the stars could also protect a city. He had drafted treaties and reformed currencies, understanding that just as bad money drives out good, false complexities drive out the simple truth. He had mixed medicines for the bishops of Warmia and the peasants of the Vistula alike, his hands stained with ink and herbs in equal measure. For nearly 500 years, the location of his grave remained a mystery, a final puzzle left by the man who loved riddles. Wars swept over the Baltic coast. Empires rose and fell. The borders of Poland shifted like sand dunes in the wind. The cathedral in Frombork stood firm, a red brick sentinel overlooking the lagoon, keeping it secret. It was not until the 21st century that the search for the old astronomer began in earnest. Archaeologists lifted the heavy floorboards near the altar of the Holy Cross, sifting through the dust of ages. In 2005, they found him. They discovered the skeletal remains of a 70-year-old man, a skull that bore a broken nose, perhaps a memento from a childhood tumble or a youthful scuffle that matched the famous self-portrait Copernicus had painted centuries before. DNA analysis, comparing the remains to a strand of hair found in one of his old books, confirmed the identity. The man who had stopped the sun and moved the earth had been found. In 2010, Nicolaus Copernicus was given a second funeral, one befitting his contribution to the human story. He was reburied in the same cathedral, but this time he was not hidden. A magnificent tombstone of black granite now marks the spot. Carved into the stone is a golden sun, encircled by 6 planets, a permanent diagram of the truth he had dared to whisper. The Latin inscription identifies him as a church canon and the founder of the heliocentric theory, finally uniting his two worlds, faith and reason, in granite and gold. His legacy, however, is not in the stone, but in the shift of perspective he bequeathed to us. Before Copernicus, humanity stood at the center of a small enclosed box, watched over by a close and attentive universe. After him, the walls fell away. He pushed the horizon back to infinity. He taught us that we are not the immobile center of the drama, but travelers on a great blue ship, voyaging through the velvet dark. This realization, often called the Copernican humiliation, is in truth a great liberation. It released the human mind from the cage of egocentrism. It allowed us to see that we are part of a vast, majestic system, a celestial ballet, more intricate and wonderful than any static hierarchy. He showed us that stability is an illusion, that even the solid earth beneath our feet is spinning, dancing, flying through the void at speeds we cannot feel but must acknowledge. Now the night sky looks different because he lived. When you look up at the stars, we're not looking at a painted ceiling, but into a deep and endless ocean. The planets are not wandering gods but siblings to our own world, sharing the same fire of the sun. The silence of the cosmos is not empty. It is the silence of a perfect machine, humming with the rhythm of gravity and light. The old astronomer of Toruń, the orphan of the Vistula, has finished his work. The anxiety of the monstrous equant is gone. The calculations are balanced. The spheres are aligned. He has returned to the earth that he set in motion, resting in the cool shadows of the cathedral, while the planet carries him in its eternal silent orbit around the sun. The the great wheel turns, smooth and uninterrupted, carrying us all through the night, through the history, and into the quiet of the stars. The heavy lids of history have closed, and the long observation is over. The universe turns without sound, a cradle rocking in the deep dark. Everything is in its place. The sun holds the center, and the earth drifts safely in the stream of time. Good night.